and it would be very, very difficult. There's always a workaround. The Great Firewall of China is very leaky, right? So the Chinese people are still able to work around that. So how would an internet service provider be able to undertake that kind of massive effort? It just wouldn't be able to. It would increase their costs and it would lower their income. So there's a big economic disincentive for them to try to do that.
Ryan, is hate speech a coherent category? I mean, is there some category of expression, words typed on a keyboard, that are so offensive that internet companies should regulate them, and we should, in fact, encourage them to do so? I'm setting aside, the images, the pornography, and all that stuff. Just words. Are there words that fall within that category that they should regulate?
I'm not so convinced that hate speech is a completely vacuous category. So I guess we disagree a little bit there. I mean, I do think that we could come up with examples of something that would look like hate speech. I'm not sure, though, if I would necessarily encourage an internet service provider who doesn't have a distinctive identity. I mean, so it's one thing, and I think this is also one of the points Craig was making, that if you are an internet service provider company or a new media platform that has a distinctive identity either around a religious identity or around some set of moral principles, then it would make sense to actually pick the speech you don't like and regulate it, because part of your mission as a new media platform is actually to both it's partly to advance a message. For the ones that don't have that, and so I would like Google and Apple just to be upfront. What type of a company are you? If you do have a set of core principles that you're trying to advance along with your internet service provider, so if you support same-sex marriage, so that's why you're going to censor those who don't, just let us know. Because I think a little more transparency here would then create some of the market incentives for someone else. I mean, the reason that Fox News now exists is because ABC, NBC, CBS are more or less telling us the same thing on 3 different channels. And Roger Ailes says, half of the market's not being served. I can now create something here. So, I think, look, some of the rhetoric that you'll hear from neo-Nazis about Jews would be a clear instance of hate speech. And if I was running an internet service company, I would want to censor that. And I think some of the rhetoric that you'll hear from the Ku Klux Klan about African Americans is clearly hate speech, and I would want to censor that. But I would be upfront about it. I'd be, look, the type of media company that I'm running is one that doesn't partake in anti-Semitism or in racial bigotry. I think what we should do is challenge Apple and other internet and new media companies to tell us, like, what's your position on the marriage question? Is the reason why you're censoring this because the type of rhetoric that it used? So if the rhetoric of the Manhattan Declaration app said something like, God hates fags and they're all going to hell, maybe that would be over the top. But the rhetoric that it actually used is something that Chuck Colson, Timothy George, and Robert George wrote. It was just standard kind of like Christian theology on marriage. So in that case, you can't say that the rhetoric that they used was inflammatory. You actually have to say the substance of what they said was inflammatory. In which case, I just want Apple to be honest about it. Let the people know, because if it's really the case that, we've had 31 states that have amended their constitution and each one has passed. So if there's a majority of Americans who would disagree with Apple, someone can now create a new media platform that's going to be a competitor. Can create a market share there. So that's how I would approach it.
Craig, some commentators have suggested that these new media platforms ought to essentially have a fairness doctrine or sort of a right of rebuttal if someone is, talked about on the internet in a way that's untrue or inappropriate or slanted. Do you think that would be an appropriate part of the sort of voluntary regime of compliance that these new media platforms might have, and how would that work?
Well, I tried to think, it's easy to see how the fairness doctrine operated to our dismay when it was in existence in terms of radio and television stations. You get on and they say it's our editorial opinion that, and then you get a phone call or your lawyer gets a phone call and you get a letter saying, I've got a contrasting viewpoint. This is an issue of public controversy. I want reasonable opportunity for rebuttal. That's how it worked. Now, how do you do this in the context of the internet? Well, if I had my own Facebook page and I said, I believe, for instance, that Islam has the wrong idea of who Jesus was. Jesus is part and parcel of Islamic theology, but I think they've got it wrong, and here's where they get it wrong. And the Facebook staffer sends me a message saying, if you do not allow such and such an imam to respond on your Facebook page, then we're going to take down your site. Now, that would perhaps be a way in which the fairness doctrine type approach would apply. My Facebook page would be taken down if I didn't accommodate speech I didn't want. But here's where the First Amendment paradigm, I think, is helpful in terms of Supreme Court jurisprudence. The Supreme Court's been clear that the First Amendment protects freedom of speech not only in what I choose to say, but what I don't want to be forced to say against my will. Forced speech of an opinion that I don't agree with is just as much of a violation as my inability to say those things that I do believe in. So my being forced to post something on my Facebook page, my editorial zone, my editor's office, so to speak, violates an equivalent form of freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, based on our First Amendment paradigm. So I think I see a problem with that from that perspective. Now, there are other remedies I think that we could seriously consider. For instance, if outrageous speech were given a label. Apple, as example, now has parental controls in some of its apps, which I think is commendable, if they work. The problem with the parental controls in television as a remedy to indecency is that they really have not, A, done a good job of screening, or B, the ratings that are applied as the mechanism to drive the rating system were faulty. So if they work in theory, then it might be a good remedy. But the problem is we've had the problem in TV ratings as a solution to indecency. I see no reason why the same problem might not arise here also.
You know, some of the examples that you listed in your report reflect, frankly, an unhealthy view of free speech values. We've talked a little bit about how competition might be a mechanism by which the new media platforms are encouraged to have a healthier view. What other sorts of things, carrots and sticks, encouragements, threats, as it were, are available to encourage these new media platforms to have a healthier view of free speech values? Any thoughts to the panel?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is if the American people had the information that is in the report or that is revealed today, I think they would demand that, that this be taken care of. The problem is most people aren't aware. And so I think, in addition to obviously the private industry cleaning up itself, I think the thing that's going to cause that is people to know that that this is actually happening. I think most people would be shocked to know of a number of these examples. I mean, every time I've ever told anybody about the Manhattan Declaration app being taken, they look at me like, you're kidding me. And I'd say that's, a lot of people that I've mentioned it because I've given talks and talked about this as an element of religious freedom and what's going on in the country today. So I really think getting awareness out, if Congress were to hold a hearing on this eventually and it were to get out into the media, et cetera, I think that could do it. But I don't know that I like any government answer because I'm very skeptical because of what I've done for the last years of my life. And I think it's much better to allow the free market and the free marketplace of ideas, especially when it comes to religious expression. But I do think that just by calling attention to it, that can make a big difference in resolving the issues.
Any other thoughts? Carrots and sticks, encouragements?
Certainly neither offered by the government, and I guess I say that as the only government speaker here today. You really, regulation of speech is fantastic as long as your friends are in political power. But once they slip out of power and someone else is there, then you really will regret having made that choice.
I think one thing we could do is, I agree that the majority of the people don't know about this, and if they did, there would be an outcry and there would be pressure on the companies to change their policies. It may also be helpful, and I wonder how helpful it'll be, but depending on how intellectually honest the people who run these companies are, just to kind of show them where the tradition of free speech comes from, because it comes from the high liberal classical tradition, someone like J.S. Mill on liberty. And the argument he makes for why free speech, not just at like a government level, but why even citizens should try to foster free speech in all of their private activities is, look, someone makes an argument. It's either going to be wrong, in which case you get an opportunity to debunk it. And so it gives you now, you're not going to hold on to lazy orthodoxy because someone has now challenged it. You now get a chance to explain why it's wrong and everyone's better. It may be that the new argument's right. And so look, you've been believing something false. Someone now makes an argument and this is the right argument. And now you've been taken out of ignorance. Like, why would you be against that? And he said, or the more likely is that it's going to be a mixture of the two. And so it's going to open up room for a dialogue. It seems to me that if we can explain that to some of the people who are in charge of these things, look, the pedigree of what you're doing doesn't lie, I mean, the censorship doesn't lie with the progressive-looking liberal a la J.S. Mill. What he's arguing against is the Austrian regime and those who would censor any sort of dissenting views or views of progress, things like that. I don't know how effective that would be because I imagine that the ones who are censoring the Manhattan Declaration know that they're on the right side of history and that their view is on the side of progress. But, I mean, a little humility might go a long way.
Ryan, you're giving me an open door to beat the drum about the name of our subunit in
Milton got
NRB.
there first.
Yeah, John, I studied Milton in college, worked my way through the Old English version of Paradise Lost, and when we got to the Areopagitica, I, for some reason, had remembered it, perhaps because of the length of the Latin term. But Milton, and he had a Christian worldview, somewhat unorthodox in some of his theology, but certainly would be labeled as a Christian poet and a Christian literary figure of his time, but also an astute observer of politics and all things public policy. And the English government was about to license every printing press in the realm, asking the printing press owners to sign an agreement saying that they could be licensed to use the printing press if they would agree to censor the things that were critical of the ruling government. And John Milton said, no, wait a minute, if we really believe that the gospel of Jesus Christ is the truth and that good ideas will rise, the truth will rise, and false ideas, bad ideas will fall, then the only way that's going to work out is if you allow both good and bad ideas to compete in the marketplace. And it was interesting when I later found out when I was in law school, I can't remember who had cited this fact, but some law review article or some pundit indicated that Milton was cited more by the Founding Fathers during their debates on free speech than any other source of motivation for the idea of a free marketplace. So I think your idea is well taken, and that is that we have to appeal to the better angels of their nature, if there are those, that free speech on the long term is going to be beneficial. They're banking on the fact that they're on the side of history with regard to a civil rights issue. So whether this is a civil rights issue or a moral issue, either way you look at it, free speech is going to benefit, I think, both sides of this debate if we allow these new media companies to allow it to flourish.
And I do think the stick a little bit is that they are really endangering themselves if they don't do something about it. Because I think they're inviting, I mean, there will be government entities who will think it's now their responsibility to clean this up because they're not cleaning it up themselves. So while I would never advocate government intervention, I think it will begin to occur if they don't take care of this problem. And so I think that alone should wake up these larger companies to come up with an approach that works and that Americans find acceptable.
Well, we have this delightful room for another 15 or 20 minutes, and at this point I'd like to open up for time of questions and answers, maybe, I hope. Anyone have a question? Yes, sir.
I remember the situation with eHarmony, and I think it was Dr. Warren who did not want to have it, and the argument was that since it wasn't a religious organization, it couldn't take his religion and impose it. I remember, I believe it was, we had a discussion one time, and I think the concern becomes with the apps, and I'd just like all of your feedback on this. To what degree is an app the equivalent of having a phone number, and there would be no way that someone would say, this church or that church or this organization can't have a phone number? To what degree are we cutting off the ability for these groups to reach out and for other people to contact them by taking away their abilities to have apps, the same way it would be if we cut off their ability to have a website or a telephone number?
I'll make mine short and sweet. Steve Jobs was interviewed, and I think it was Playboy magazine, like in the 80s.
You just read the articles, right?
Yeah. Actually, I was reading a review of the article. I want to make that clear. And it was in conjunction with the death of Steve Jobs that they, I think it was Wired Magazine, had a history of their various interviews with him to celebrate his innovation and his genius, which he clearly was. But he mentioned his interview in the 80s, I think it was, and he said, look, the internet and web-based communication platforms are going to be to the 21st century what Ma Bell was to the 20th century, and I think his prophecy was certainly correct. The problem with that analogy is if we take that to the logical extreme, then these web-based networks should be regulated like the telephone. Now, you can't, and I'm not suggesting that they should be, but I'm saying we need to ask ourselves, why wouldn't we get to that point? For instance, if my church were to get a call from the telephone company saying, we read your website, and boy, you've got some crazy religious ideas, so we're going to discontinue your phone service. And I would say, well, how am I going to communicate with the world? Well, start your own telephone network. Now, clearly that's not a feasible remedy, nor is that a likely scenario, because it's a regulated industry. Again, we don't want the internet web-based companies, these platforms, to be regulated, but Jobs himself seemed to suggest that they would have that kind of monopoly power over communications. So how do we stop internet-based giants from becoming regulated industries if, in fact, they are admitting they are as powerful and all-encompassing to communications as the Bell telephone system?
Other questions? Comments? You've all been so thorough. Any concluding remarks that any of you would like to offer? Oh, question here. Chris.
Yeah, I was just, I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but I was thinking, we were talking about what is, there are a lot of Christians where their house is controlled by a Republican Party that, well, Jackie was saying, these industries come here for a lot of things. It's not like we don't have leverage. I mean, we're in the era of Chicago politics. Maybe we should, think more like a Chicagoan or something. But, and this is sort of blunt force, and I recognize this. I mean, I have a feeling that there's a good sense that if you go to Silicon Valley and you talk to people, there are good people there and they may be able to work out and understand. They may, as you were saying, they may not understand the principles and sort of what they're doing is sort of problematic. But it's also a case that they come to these bodies for entree into the use of, copyright law. We were talking about, what is it that prevents somebody from just making apps and releasing them, putting them along iPhones. I don't know what all the law is there, but it's law, right? And, opening up some of these systems, you may not have to regulate them, but there may be, and I would really sort of dislike doing that, but if it comes to having free speech in America or having, to sort of let these people kind of understand that they aren't the only people on the planet and their worldviews are not the only ones around, maybe we just got to,
Response? What I think I heard was almost a suggestion, not so much of direct regulation, but, there's a lot of benefits and treatments that these large companies get from Congress and the agencies, and is that a context in which a conversation about this happens?
Yeah,
is that
I mean, characterize it something like Don Corleone or something, but I mean, the people here can sort of say that there are a lot of good people. Religious expression is not, it's not pornography, it's not just Sturmer in the 1930s, right? I mean, let's get serious, there is stuff that's really bad and horrible. I mean, the people that did that were put to death and murdered, right? I mean, so if you sort of put the balance in, look, anyone who in the context of, let's say, any sort of religious, orthodox religion, I mean, we could just start there, maybe you sort of go out, and you put it in terms that are not, derogatory to the person, that's where we're going, you're not in Fred Phelps world, those guys, right? We would like you to consider, I mean, seriously, protecting the rights of speech. I don't think that that's some, we have a lot of people who are our friends. You're not really kind of looking at what they do, the benefits they provide to society. It's, you know, I think the House of Representatives and the Congress has a lot of, you know, moral suasion.
And bullet pulpit, I think Kelly was talking about the, you know, the hearing, and any feedback on what Chris had to say? Panelists?
I'm hearing, and Chris, I respect your work over the Family Research Council as one of their scholars. You're suggesting kind of a blunt force, a little bit more blunt force approach that the folks who control the levers of power here on Capitol Hill could use. I mean, we're talking about broadband, we're talking about approval of innovation, and I'm hearing Commissioner McDowell say, yes, but anybody but government incentives, because those all, no matter how well-intentioned, those always kind of go awry. So I'd love an argument, an argument that it's going to break this tie between these two approaches, because frankly, I see, from my perspective, benefits in both of them. One's a philosophical, which I certainly side with Commissioner McDowell. On the other hand, Chris, I see the opportunity now that may not exist 5 years from now for that sort of influence to be used on Capitol Hill as these companies come and seek opportunity to expand their networks and their influence. So I'm not sure, I'm not sure how we break that tie.
I have a non-lawyer question to ask the lawyers. Is there any doctrine of contract law that might entitle me, if I'm a subscriber to a system or a user, might entitle me to a reasonable expectation that I should be able to have access to all otherwise lawful content, and that the provider, by denying me that, in the case of your example of hate speech, Kelly, they really have an issue about the question of marriage, and so they're denying me access to lawful content. Do I have any contract law doctrines or ideas that I could advance to that?
Well, I mean, you could try. The reality is you probably wouldn't get very far, and even if you did, they would just change the contract and put it in the gazillion pages that you sign before you get anything. So, you know, it would only last about a millisecond if you were able to be amazingly and miraculously successful. So, you know, I don't think it's the solution because they can contractually put whatever agreement they want eventually, you know, with everybody who comes from there on.
I'd like to hear, Greg, your opinion about this. The only thing I came across, I think there was a restatement of contracts, a statement about public policy, and some courts have imputed into a contract the requirement that they not violate concepts of public policy, you know, race discrimination, things like this. But those are aberrations, and the concept that we're talking about is so novel that I think the court would be very slow to recognize or to impute a public policy requirement that they respect free speech in new media user service contracts. I just think it's too new an area for them to do that.
Particularly when there's a countervailing free speech interest that Ryan talked about on behalf of the company, right? So I concur. Baylor J. concurring. Other questions or comments? All right, well, on behalf of National Religious Broadcasters, thank you all for coming. Thank you for making this wonderful room available to us, and have a great rest of the day. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists.
Excellent, thank you.